Robin Rothenberg, welcome. I know we met each other quite a few years ago, and I have to say you're one of the most open-minded yoga instructors that I have come across. And I think your work in bringing and looking at the different dimensions of breathing for yoga has been instrumental. And I'm sure you've had a little bit of resistance along the way, because I can imagine that people who are trained in one modality is beginning to think, well, this is the way I've been trained, and what else can I add to it? So we'll have a good conversation on this. You know, we were just chatting just before we started recording. You're based in Falls City, Seattle. You're in the field. Can you just give us a little bit of background information?
About me and my work?
About you and your work.
Okay, so I'm a yoga therapist, which is to say that I went to school beyond yoga teacher training school to learn a lot about anatomy, physiology, Ayurveda, and how the body works both from Eastern and Western perspectives, and then a lot of deep study in yoga philosophy of the mind as well as psychology. So I work with people who have chronic pain or chronic health issues. So I don't do yoga fitness. I mean, there was a time when I did more of like general yoga classes, but for the past 20 years, I focused on working with people with chronic ailments and helping them utilizing techniques in yoga, movement, certainly, and adaptive movement, breathing practices and adaptive breathing practices, and then mantra and mudra, using sound and visualization, meditative practices like yoga nidra and restorative practices to help to bring them back into balance with themselves, as well as looking at lifestyle and diet and that kind of thing from the lens of Ayurveda. So I run an accredited training program for yoga teachers who want to become yoga therapists, and I'm very involved in yoga research as well, and have done quite a bit on low back pain and menopause and arthritis.
Great. And I can imagine there's a really good application for yoga in people with chronic health issues, from both a mental perspective, a spiritual perspective, and also in terms of movement and breathing.
Yes. Yeah.
Your breathing journey has been interesting. You wrote a book about 4 years ago or 3 years ago called Restoring Prana.
Is it that long ago?
I don't know. Well, I have it on top of my shelf here. It's probably 3 years ago, is it?
3 years ago, I think. Yeah, it was published in 2019, I think. So maybe
two.
But I started writing it before that.
And what did you uncover when you were writing that? It's a big volume. It's 120,000 words, if I remember correctly. A lot of
400
words.
pages.
A lot of
pictures too. A lot of pictures too.
Not to put people off. But I would say that it's the breathing Bible for yoga instructors. What did you uncover when you came across when you started going down that journey? In terms of
you started me down that journey, or actually, our friend, our mutual friend Pippa started me down that journey, introducing me to Buteyko, and then my dealing with my own respiratory issues and the traditional pranayama practices that I had been working with just weren't helping. In fact, it felt like they were making things worse. And so then Pippa had this incredible experience with her own breathing, and she was a longtime yoga student, and she had severe, asthma and COPD, and so I turned to her and I said, "Would you teach me how to breathe?" And from the time I started working with the Buteyko method, which was completely counter to everything I've been taught in yoga school, my mind started buzzing with how could this be, and what is this all about, and what's really happening, because that's the kind of curious mind I have. And so then I was like, I have to learn everything I can about this. I need to understand more. I can feel what's happening, but I need to understand what's happening. And then, I jumped on a plane and I flew to Ireland and met you, and the rest is history, Patrick.
The rest is history.
And then I've taken your training 4 times, and and so just trying to get the physiology in my head, because it's complicated, and then getting it to a place where I could then explain it to my yoga colleagues, students, friends, teachers, in a way that helped them to understand how this is actually not yoga. It's not yoga, because it's actually, when I did my research for the book, It's not just that, it's not a Buteyko book, which sometimes I've heard, oh yeah, she just wrote a Buteyko book. I'm like, why would I do that? There's so many wonderful Buteyko practitioners who know a lot more than me about Buteyko who have written Buteyko books. I'm writing a yoga book, but it incorporates the understanding that I've learned from working with you and Buteyko into the yoga context, because the original teachings of pranayama really do emphasize this light, subtle breathing and breath holds, kumbhakas, and that's really where the juice of pranayama is in the not breathing part of the breath. Not the breathing part, but the not breathing part. And so helping people to understand that. So my intention with the book was to bring the yoga community in to this idea that there is something that got lost in the translation down through the ages.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. My experience was, I don't know, 97, 98, I think it was 98. And I started just on the basis of an article, and then I found some more information about it. And I started breathing less air. And the temperature in my hands started to increase. And I did the nose unblocking exercise and my nose opened up. And even though what I was doing was breathing less air, which is the very thing that people would say, you know, breathe more air, take fuller breaths, etc., the very fact that it made a difference to my physiology told me
yes,
there was something in this. I find it amazing, Robin, that with breath, it has got so mixed up. I really, I can't get my head around it. I cannot get my head around, like, if I think of the potential for yoga, it is absolutely unbelievable.
it is.
And I will give you this description. If, for example, somebody going into a yoga studio with asthma, with anxiety, with sleep apnea, with digestive problems, with poor movement, with all of these issues, but if that person was to get an instruction in breathing from three dimensions, not just in terms of the biomechanics, but also the biochemistry, and bring in resonance frequency breathing. And for that student to realize that how I breathe inside the studio, it's not just limited to the studio. I need to bring this breathing practice outside the studio and have my mouth closed during sleep and breathe through my nose during physical exercise. You could literally transform the health of millions of people. Like, I don't want to say that whatever has happened, yoga has not reached its full potential, and yoga will not reach its full potential unless people start investigating deeper about breathing. And I'm not, you know, I've done a few yoga sessions here going down to my local Galway on the west coast of Ireland. And a lot of the breaths are full, big breaths. And, you know, I use the example that if you hear people breathing in a class and you're hearing them intentionally taking more air in, well, that's likely that a lot of these people will be hyperventilating. And yeah, so, you know, it's an amazing journey. You know, can you just imagine what would happen? So from the biochemistry point of view, you're talking about the original yoga when they taught that word subtle. What does subtle mean?
Well, the word is sukshma in Sanskrit, and it means when they describe it, like I looked at a variety of different texts and how they describe pranayama, and there's a lot of really, you know, I mean, it's kind of crazy, some of the stuff, you know, in terms of how they kept time and all of that. It's humorous, but one of the things
give me an example.
You know, like in terms of like counting the breath holds, because they didn't have a stopwatch. You know, now we have our phone, it has a stopwatch, you know, we count seconds, it's kind of standard fare. But back then it was like, well, you know, circle your finger around your knee as 3 times, and then however many times the cowbell rings, you know, like that, and you're holding your breath at time. You know, it's all very arbitrary. And there's like not just 1 or 2 ideas like that, but there's like 15, 20 different that I came across, and they all sounded to me kind of, you know, like, you know, wacko, but I, you know, humorous. I could see then they were like trying to come up with something consistent that they could reference, right? But relative to a stopwatch, you know, it's all very arbitrary. You know,
and the
cow moves 5 times, or I don't know, like crazy. But the subtlety was consistent. So like how far out you can feel your breath, on your hand. So the farther out, the less pranayama, the less subtle, the less shukshma it is. So if you can feel your breath, it was like, should be like right underneath, or even one description is like if they put a piece of cotton underneath, a cotton ball underneath your nose, it wouldn't move the cotton at all. You'd be breathing so lightly.
So
right?
it was really
Which is very different than than the cleansing breaths that we teach in yoga, where you can feel the breath like way out here. They say that's not pranayama.
Is it cleansing though? Like people have often asked me, like, why breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth? Personally, I can't give any valid reason why you should breathe out through the mouth, because I think if it was important to do it, that nature would have equipped us and we would have evolved to breathe that way. The animal world doesn't breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. Young infants don't do it. And intuitively, if we didn't have any information, or if nobody said anything about breathing, and our ancestors, I would imagine that our ancestors were innate nasal breathers, both in through the nose and out through the mouth. Now, I think
in through the nose and out through the nose.
Sorry, in through the nose and out through the nose. I think in India, it could make sense when the temperature is really hot as a cooling mechanism to get rid of heat of the body. But then on the downside, you're losing moisture. So I haven't figured it out. And there's a lot of questions. The cleansing breath, like people often say, well, what about getting rid of toxins? Is there, what's your take on that? Is there something in that you are getting rid of toxins, or is it just an idea that just took hold?
I couldn't find anything that scientifically that supported that idea. I think I heard from teachers, and when I was, in yoga school learning, that getting rid of the CO2, this is the idea. And I bring this out as a breath myth in my book, but you get rid of the CO2 so that there's more room for oxygen, which is crazy, because that's not how the body works. Yes. It's not like, oh, now there's more space, so now the oxygen can go where the CO2 was, So I was kind of embarrassed that not only did I learn that, but there was actually a period of my life where I actually spoke it, because my teacher told me. I think that's part of it, is this, allegiance to the lineage, the traditions, the teachers. I have never been in a guru-disciple relationship like that with my teachers, but I've had incredible respect for them, because I've learned so much from them, and so much of what I've learned from them about yoga, about myself, has enhanced my health in so many ways. So I feel that loyalty, and yet, facts is facts, and, I can't go on saying things once you know that they're coming from a place of ignorance. So I could no longer say, yes, clear the lungs of all the air, get rid of, because of course that's also not true, and you're not able to do that. Thank God. There's always, a residual, volume of air left in the lungs. And so all these things just getting more refined. And that's my call to yoga teachers, yoga therapists, is to just become more educated about the respiratory system. There's a big absence of, it's like we're learning these very intricate and potent techniques, like, Kapalabhati and Vastrika, and, these nostril techniques, and we're being told a story about what's happening without any understanding of respiratory physiology. And it's like asking somebody with back pain to go into an advanced back bend, and you don't know anything about the anatomy of the back, of the spine, or an advanced forward bend, which could be even worse for somebody with severe back pain, depending on what kind of back condition they have. But if you don't understand what a healthy back is, and you don't understand the anomalies and the pathologies that can go on, and how that impacts functional movement, then you better be really cautious about what you're doing, asking their spine to do, right? And in the same way, how can we teach breathing and call ourselves breathing experts when we don't understand the respiratory system and what functional breathing is, before we start manipulating the breath? And is this breath appropriate for this person? Because if this person is already an impaired breather in one way or another, and then we tax their respiratory system. I mean, it doesn't just affect the respiratory system, it affects the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the nervous system, and the mind, right?
Yeah.
It affects all of it. Every other system of the body is impacted. So it's not a little thing. That's why pranayama is so central to yoga, because the yogis got it. They got, if you can really control your breath, and you can shift your physiology, and through that you can shift your entire experience of life, your health, the clarity of your mind, your energy, everything.
If original yogis, if you were to transplant one into the current environment, into a yoga studio, what would you see as different? For example, when I was at your yoga studio, when was that? Was it 2019, just before COVID?
Right before, like 2 weeks before COVID hit.
Good timing.
Yeah.
And the one thing that's remarkable is that we never heard anybody breathe. I don't know, I think there might have been 15, 20 people, even 25 people. We could not hear one person breathe in the class. It was all about conservation of the breath. There's, for many of the poses and for the postures, you were feeling air hunger. And I'm just wondering if we had an original yogi and it was all about the subtlety of the breath, it would be very much along those lines. That it's, I suppose, for people who are listening in who don't understand about breathing, what's the significance of the air hunger? What's the significance of carbon dioxide? What does it do, say, for example, to the blood vessels, or the Bohr effect, even, to talk about that a little bit?
You're asking me.
I'm asking you. This is a test.
Is a test, Patrick. What did I learn in all those trainings? Yeah, so I think one of the things, I'll put it contextually in my own experience, like when I started, I would do breath holds, I would do kumbhakas, in my pranayama practice, along with big inhales and big exhales. But I didn't understand what was happening inside while I was doing it. Working with you gave me the understanding of what was happening. What I could feel as I breathed less, like very little amounts, like the air hunger, like brought my breathing down so subtle that I felt like, ooh, maybe this isn't enough, like, what if I died breathing this little, and I would kind of trip out on my brain, in my mind, and then I would tease myself by saying, well, you're obviously getting enough oxygen to make up this story, so you're fine. Like, just keep doing it.
That's logic.
And I could feel, I could feel, like you say, like the warming in my fingertips, and I could feel this shift. Like it was odd, because while there was this a little bit of anxiousness of, gosh, feels so much less than what I'm used to, and yet there was this kind of sea of calm that this anxiety was floating in. It's like, okay, so again, I'm curious. I'm always fascinated by new experiences. That was a new one. I had never felt that while doing pranayama. And then doing the breath holds and feeling more of that warmth and feeling this kind of wobbly sensation in my legs. And then afterwards, this feeling of clarity in my mind and my eyes. It's like my vision was like, everything was, in technicolor, and, my senses just felt so finely tuned. All of that, I could feel. There was no question in my mind that there was a different experience. It wasn't just like before with pranayama, I would feel a little calmer. I'd feel a little more centered, a little more present. But this was that amplified, and then all these physiologic changes. So now I understand that the increasing of the CO2 helps to open the airways. So then breathing becomes lighter, which was also one of the sensations that was very profound for me, somebody who had always struggled with breathing, to feel this incredible lightness. There was no effort, and there's just all this space, no struggle for breath.
So you didn't have chest tightness, in other words, the bronchioles are dilated.
I didn't even know that I had chest tightness until there was the absence of chest tightness. And yes. I was like, what is this? It's not, it's pleasant, but I don't even recognize this sensation because I had never had it before. So there was that. And then the increase in circulation with the opening of the blood vessels because of the CO2 increasing the dilation of the smooth muscle. Am I doing okay?
Yeah, doing good.
Yeah. So then understanding the Bohr effect and how in the presence of sufficient amounts of carbon dioxide, then oxygen is able to release from the bloodstream into the cells of the body and actually oxygenate them. And there was something about that. It was like, oh, we've been all focused on getting oxygen in. I call it like front loading, right? And not really attending to the magic that happens within the cells. It's in that, it's the cellular respiration and the oxygenation. Like you can breathe in like that all day long, and it doesn't mean that you're getting better oxygenation. And so understanding what happens in the lungs with the, perfusion of the gases, and then in the cells, and that the inhalation and the exhalation at the nose, what happens at the nose or mouth, right, is only one part of it. It impacts what happens down on the other levels. But what really makes a difference in terms of health and well-being is what happens at those other levels. And if we are ignorant, we're just focusing on getting more in or more out, or less in or less out, but not really looking at, the domino effect and how that is setting our whole system up to chemically be in balance or not, then we're missing the key. And the yogis got that. Without a doubt, they got that.
Yeah, I think they did in terms of the breath holds, because when you read some of the literature, they were able to suspend the breath for a minute plus. They were able to breathe for 1 hour with 1 breath per minute, and it was a subtle breath. And in order to be able to do that, you really need to have a reduced ventilatory response to carbon dioxide. So in simple terms, carbon dioxide comes from the tissues into the blood. And when CO2 increases, blood pH drops, and the brain sends an increased stimulus to breathe. So if we're overly sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, we feel a quicker urge or a stronger urge to breathe. And yogis had trained their respiratory system to be able to cope with the increased carbon dioxide. And as a result, they had such suspension and conservation of the breath. It's pretty amazing, And I can only think, like, there was an article that was written by a Dr. Singh, I'm not sure, you might have come across it, the vagotropic effect of hypercapnia, because we always talk about slow breathing to 6 breaths per minute as a means of stimulating the vagus nerve. But I was only came across it a year or so about that increased CO2 in the blood also stimulates the vagus nerve, and that we can stimulate the vagus nerve from breathing light with air hunger, and also strengthen the baroreflex. So in terms of the autonomic nervous system, it's really going much deeper now, isn't it? It's not, carbon dioxide is one aspect of it, but we have the baroreflex here on the other side of it, the autonomic nervous system. And do you think with yoga there was a nice balance there, because the original yogi knew how to activate the parasympathetic response and dampen the sympathetic response, but they also knew how to stress the body if they wanted to as well.
Exactly. And so that's the thing, is they were well trained and resilient on all sides. So there are breathing practices like Kapalabhati and Bhastrika that actually increase the sympathetic response, that and then have we call it like a post-digestive effect of calming, right? It's like you stress in order to relax. And of course, this is very similar to what Wim Hof is doing in his work, right? He's kind of pulling on that, which works with healthy systems, I think, but is really challenging for people who don't have that kind of internal resilience to start with. I think it can be problematic. Just like the yoga practices of Kapalabhati and Bhastrika, like I have great respect for them now because I understand what they're about. I don't feel like they're horrible and dangerous. I just feel like you have to understand what they're useful for and who they're useful for and when to utilize them.
Yes.
And that they're risky for people that are not functional breathers to begin with, and who have other kinds of inflammatory conditions in their body, and that it can actually throw off their blood gases even more, and then have that, kind of cascading downturn effect
Yeah.
on their physiology. But the yogis also were, physically active. And, like I say in the book, it's like they were eating organic because what other option did they have? And, they were, keeping themselves warm and, not by turning up the thermostat, but by either physically moving or working with their breathing practices to increase the heat, which Kapalabhati and Bhastrika do very well. They were living a healthier life than most of us do. And the moving piece is really critical. I mean, this is where I feel like if we can get ourselves clear about the breath and the connection between asana, which has been, taken up most of the screen in modern yoga, everything is asana. And then you throw in some breathing with the asana and you call it yoga. But asana is really important because movement is really important, and healthy movement in this sedentary world that we live in the West is critically important. People have to do something other than their work to move, because most of us don't do manual labor and don't move. We sit like this. Now we sit and we stare at a screen,
Yes.
really all day long. And that affects our chemistry and our physiology and our CO2 levels and all of that. And so we have to do something. And yoga offers a variety of ways of moving that can be safe and useful and adaptive for any type of body, pretty much. And then you bring the breath in that complements that. And it's so powerful to bring those two together. And I'd love to see the yoga world moving in that direction of understanding the relationship between those two.
Just the resonance frequency breathing, in terms of the training that the person was doing, I often feel that when there's such an emphasis on focusing on the respiratory rate, there's very little emphasis on the tidal volume, and there's very little emphasis on minute ventilation. And, I suppose in food terms, we could describe it that if you were eating a plate full of dinner, somebody hands you a spoon, that's your tidal volume. And the number of spoonfuls you need to eat all the food is the respiratory rate. But in breathing, we focus primarily, or many people focus on the respiratory rate, which is akin to just focusing on the number of spoonfuls. But it doesn't take into consideration the size of the spoon, and it doesn't take into consideration the food on the plate. So,
yeah,
it's part of it is overlooked. Yeah, like I see a lot of fast upper chest breathing and a respiratory rate of 25 breaths per minute. I would have been really working on slowing that down. So
yeah.
I know we have one breath whereby we take a flicker of air in and out of the nose, but that's only one exercise out of 26. But this is, I suppose, the degree to which people can understand it. So in terms of the breathing exercises, it's guiding the person through it, slowing down the breath, bringing, the breath more optimal amplitude of the diaphragm. I often separate them. I feel, with the three dimensions of breathing, it can be very confusing for people if we try and bring all three in together. And sometimes I focus on the biochemistry first with air hunger, getting people used to that. And then we can move on to the biomechanics when they have a good grasp of that. And then resonance frequency breathing, or you could start with the biomechanics first. What way do you typically work when you have your students? Is there a particular sequence that you work with, or do you change it?
Yeah, in general, I actually start with the biomechanics because for a couple of reasons. One, it supports a good vagal tone. So it in and of itself quiets, calms, relaxes people, which puts them in a state where they're more able to work with the air hunger and not be so flipped into panic. It releases the tension in the neck, shoulders, and jaw, right? They can feel it's soothing. There's a soothing quality to the engagement of the abdominals and the inward hug, and they feel like they have control. It brings their focus down, so it's grounding, right? And they can feel the relaxation. They feel like it's easier to breathe, right? Once they get that. And so I usually start there and just teach them some good abdominal diaphragmatic biomechanics. And I have, my little tricks that I can do it in, 5 minutes or less, you know. And then from there, you know, and working with them, keeping this passive and then taking the volume down, just like, okay, now keep breathing like that, just lighten it up, cut it back 10%, and then,
Yes.
you know, like a little bit more, and just to where you find that edge, right? And they're in a more receptive place because they're not coming into it
Yes.
like this. So I just found it's more effective and efficient. And that's kind of, you know, sometimes I call myself an efficiency expert, you know, like there's, you know, time short. So like, what's the shortest path for most people? And again, it's not true for everybody, because some people need something else before that. You know, if they're, you know, let's just start with closing your mouth, right? But beyond that, you know, in general, I find that this is a very effective and easeful way to take them in, and something they can return to again and again. Like they can just put their hand on their belly and do that little bit of drawing inward with the exhale and find that rhythm and flow. And of course, it supports functional movement as well. And since I work with a lot of people who not only have breathing issues, but also have back pain or neck pain or, you know, hip issues or whatever, IBS, then getting that, the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles sinking well, so that they've got that, what I call like jellyfish movement in their belly and their lower ribs, right? Then I don't know if you, you know, the HPP Foundation.
Yes.
Yeah, they have some great posts on Instagram, and they posted, did you see this recent one where there was an MRI video of somebody chest breathing and somebody abdominal diaphragmatic breathing? I need to get a copy of it. It's profound. It looks, the chest breathing, it's front and the inside, and you see this going on. It's like, it reminded me of a gerbil on a wheel.
Sure.
Like there's no way anyone could feel good breathing that way. And then there's this nice, you know, sort of this outward, inward kind of, you know, lovely. And you see the heart right there, just being just gently, you know, bounced, as I say, you know, by the diaphragm, as opposed to, you know, you know, like a jackhammer pressing on it. It's profound. The diaphragm is profound.
It is, but Robin, what's more profound is that 75% of the anxiety population have dysfunctional breathing patterns, and very often they have that fast upper chest breathing, and they're going seeking help. But you know, is their breathing being targeted, or is it just a simple case of take a few deep breaths for yourself? You know, there's something being, I don't know, human beings, we're really, really kind of stuck in sometimes a very narrow zone, and the professions can be very stuck in a very narrow zone. And when I think of a person with anxiety, you have to think of their sleep quality. You know, people with depression, they're feeling tired. Is it the constant fatigue and insomnia and obstructive sleep apnea which is feeding into depression? And again, I can only think about many of these people are going to seek out yoga because they won't, like a lot of people don't want to go to a gym for proper reason. You know, gyms can be fairly boring. You're up in a treadmill, you're lifting weights. It's not going to be for everybody. But they will seek out yoga as a means of helping with their health. And for the yoga instructor to be able to guide the individual and change their breathing pattern to slow down the respiratory rate, to reduce the ventilatory response to carbon dioxide, to improve the biomechanics, and to take that into the individual's everyday life, it would be amazing. In the anxiety population, how has it been overlooked? I know you're not going to have the answer, but I'm sure you've thought about it. You know, how has functional breathing been overlooked?
Yeah, I think there's been a big emphasis in the world of yoga on the nervous system. I talk about this in the book, but this is certainly the way it was introduced to me. Like the long exhales support the parasympathetic nervous system response. So you want to get people breathing, you know, nice and slow and long exhale, right? And then you relax them. So, you know, all of that, right? And then, you know, so people, and there's an immediate response of it's more relaxing, certainly, especially if you've been chest breathing, right?
Yes.
To do that. So it's this short-term, let's say, satisfaction or gratification, right?
Mm.
That's true. It's valid. People experience it. It's not that it's not.
It's a quick.
What
It's a
people
very good.
experience.
It's a very good fix. Yeah, it
It's a
is.
good quick fix, but what is missing is the understanding is what happens over time if you take that in, and that's how you're always calming yourself down. This was what happened to me. I mean, on top of having, you know, a pervasive dysfunctional breathing pattern since early childhood with all kinds of respiratory issues and illness, but and a lot of anxiety and trauma and stress in my home and all of that, you know, psycho-emotionally, how that was impacting me. And I had a lot of trouble sleeping as well. So all of that, and then coming into yoga and being told like the way to, you know, nirvana is these long, slow, deep breaths. So I was constantly sighing, you know, I was just always like, you know, I'm taking care of myself. I'm relaxing myself. I'm helping to take the edge off. And I sighed all the time, you know, like, you know, 6-8 times an hour, you know, I was constantly sighing and thinking, believing that I was calming my system down, that I was doing the right thing. And I didn't know, because I didn't have all of this science behind it, you know, to understand that I was taking myself perpetually in the wrong direction. And then there was a point of no return, which was when I got sick, and, you know, and then I was coughing all the time, and then I would just, you know,
so it could be
push me off the edge of the cliff.
The breathing techniques could have exacerbated, but the basic idea behind it is actually correct, as you said. But the person doesn't have to take in the full big breath to have the relaxed exhalation. They can just take in a soft breath in through the nose and a really slow and relaxed and passive exhalation. And that will stimulate the vagus nerve. And I practice it, you know, but I practice it if there's, sometimes with Zoom, things don't go right and you could have people waiting for you and you can't log in. And sure, we've all experienced it. And here I am, okay. And I use it because I use it, especially I call it as an emergency fix. And it's a really slow, gentle breath in through your nose. You can't hear a thing. Nobody would even know you're doing it. So you could be in a workplace or an office. Nobody would have a clue. But yet you're able to hack into the nervous system. That really slow and relaxed exhalation. I think where they're making the mistake is on the inhalation. That belief that you have to take in the big breath and hear the breath and hear the breath out. You don't.
Well, I think that's part of it, Patrick, but then there's also like what you think of as a slow, relaxed, passive exhale is probably somewhere between 4 and 6 seconds long.
Yes.
Yeah. So in my training, and the way most of us are training, that's short. You want to actually get your exhale to be where it's like 16 seconds, 20 seconds long. And that's where I was. Yes. You know, that's where I was working, even sometimes, you know, inhale 30, exhale 30, right? And so slowing, but lots of, and big volume, and always audible, always ujjayi, you know, where you're contracting the epiglottis and doing it in such a way that it's making sound. Although for all of you listening, I could not find any evidence in any of the yoga texts that associated ujjayi with sound. It was always with sensation. It's always much more subtle than what we make it. It's not big, dramatic, you know, that Darth Vader sound. There was no sound. It's all about feeling the sensation, which creates this subtle bit of, you know, positive pressure, which helps to activate the diaphragm. So, and it helps with placement of the tongue. There's a nice connection from upper airways to lower airways through the back of the throat. So that's the intention as I understand it. But it was not about how big a sound can you make. But in any case, the focus on these really extended, big exhalation breaths, and like the bigger and the longer it is, the more relaxed you will be. Like there's something in, you know, in the air that myth is being consistently perpetuated. Like if a little bit of breathing slowly and extending the exhale slightly is relaxing, well, the more of that will be more relaxing, right? That's the thinking. More is always better. And it's cultural,
I think
right?
this is a Western thing, though. More is better.
It
I wonder,
is.
did the noisy Ujjayi breath come as a result when it transitioned from the East to the West? Do you think that's when the whole thing kind of got a little bit distorted?
Well, when I started yoga 30 years ago, it was over 30 years ago now, actually 35 years ago, that was not how people were breathing. That those big, and there was I was taught to breathe through my nose in yoga. In yoga, nobody said also breathe through your nose when you're not in yoga, which I wish somebody had told me, but I always breathe through my nose in yoga class, and there was no emphasis on sound, and you could not hear people breathing. That came later.
That's amazing.
It came later, and I think it came in part with Ashtanga and the hot yoga.
Yeah. I was going
there
to
was
say
something in that in the power, and it's like, and I think, you think of like the martial artist, because there is something when you make that sound, your abdominals engage. So it gives more power to, the hara, to the core, right? So there is this association with the sound on the exhale and the contraction inward of the abdominals, which does support the diaphragm moving into its relaxed position and the exhalation breath. So the sound helps to synchronize the breath in a functional way, but doing that once is not doing it consistently for an hour and a half practice while you're moving.
Do you think part of it could be that, and I don't want to stereotype the East versus the West, but a lot of people are stuck in their heads and they couldn't get their attention out of their mind onto their breathing. But one way to help them feel the breath was to get them to exaggerate their breathing.
Mm-hmm.
So then
yes.
you could actually bring some solace and bring some gap between thought, but in the process mess up the biochemistry. And just for people, if you're breathing too hard, it reduces blood flow to the brain and oxygen delivery. And this can have an arousing effect on the central nervous system, the brain. So the brain gets excited and nerve cells get excited as a result of chronic overbreathing. And especially if people carry that idea into their everyday life. But maybe that might have been just one reason. Get people to exaggerate their breathing so that they could pay attention to it, to give them some solace or gaps between their thoughts.
And here's this interesting biofeedback process that I think has happened is, yes, I think that's part of it. And then the teachers got the feedback, they're breathing, right? I can hear their breath. I can hear that it's smooth. I can hear that it's long. This tells me
they're doing it.
They're doing it right, or they're getting relaxed, and B, I'm a good teacher. And I'm saying this because I think this is more of an issue than people perhaps want to admit, but I'll go first and admit that this is one of the things that I had to deal with internally as a teacher when I shifted to more of a Buteyko reduced subtle breathing style in teaching is, I don't really know what's going on anymore inside my students. Like, they're not giving me the feedback. And then not only was it concern like, well, I don't know what's going on. So then I have to ask them, well, it's their experience. I should be asking them and not assuming anyway. But then also my ego, like, how do I know if I'm teaching it right? How do I know? I can't just see what's going on. And I realized I had to deal with some anxiety and realizing this has never been any of my business, right? And that if I'm curious, then I need to ask, how are you feeling as you breathe this way? Like, what do you notice?
Yeah.
And just let it be their experience and get myself out of the way, as opposed to, everybody's breathing nice and long and slow. And then I'm such a good teacher because this is how I'm teaching them how to take care of themselves and blah, 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 like that. It's, it was an interesting thing. Like, you couldn't have taught me that. Like, it was when I went back in as as I'd always, I'd been teaching for years, but now teaching differently. And then this kind of panicky feeling like, well, how do I know if I'm doing it right? How do I know what's happening if I can't hear my students breathe, if I can't see this dramatic movement, right? And then I have to sensitize myself to see the subtle movement and where they're moving from. And it was a whole relearning on my part. So it's not just learning the facts, it's also learning how to interact with the breath, with your students, with your clients in that more intimate way. And then engaging in the conversation of what do you notice? What do you feel when you breathe like this?
And the feedback from the students, because I suppose we're always asking the questions, is there any change in the saliva in the mouth? Is it more, is it less, is it the same? Is right changing your temperature of your hands, or do you feel more alert, or do you feel drowsy? Because the light breathing is very much a down regulator. But then again, the odd time you have somebody who's prone to anxiety and panic disorder, and the air hunger sends them the opposite direction. So we have to kind of bring them back. There's always that little bit of a...
Absolutely. And I mean, especially people who have trauma in their background, and who did a lot of breath holding to make themselves invisible so that they would not be, gone into more of that freeze and possum level, the dorsal vagal response, of the polyvagal system, where they just shut down.
This would be saying
really
they're
careful.
Home. And when there was trauma happening, they were, as kids, breathing as little as possible so they couldn't be detected.
Exactly. And so you've got to be really, really careful. Like I've seen, like, this woman that I described that was the barely breathing. I think there was a lot of trauma in her history, and that was part of her pattern, was to withhold breath. And so for her, like, getting, working with the biomechanics and more like really working on the expansion, not taking big volumes of breath, but physically expanding and doing some movement with that, with her arms to engage, and getting that feeling of like there's freedom, like it's safe to breathe.
Light, slow, deep is the acronym that I'm using, because LSD is one that people don't tend to forget. And, and then light is about the biochemistry, and slow is about resonance frequency breathing. And I think the word deep is what confuses most people, because deep is always associated with big.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah. So I make that clarification and help people to understand. So I usually say slow and low volume and low in the body, right? And then light. And people like that too. I have a question for you.
Sure.
It has to do, so this is what I have encountered as probably the biggest confusion for people who are coming from Buteyko, and then, like, they've done something with you or somebody else with Buteyko, or they've read, Oxygen Advantage, Bolt Score, CP. You say control pause. I always say comfortable pause, because there's too many people who try to over control everything in their life, and they don't need one more thing that they're trying to over control, which in part is my question. So there's a lot of confusion about this. People think the practice is the CP. And I mean, but seriously, they do. They think that the whole thing is about the CP, like, or my Bolt score, I'm like, let's just talk about how you're breathing. Can we just work with your breath? And let's put that aside. There's this obsession about the CP. There's this obsession about it, to the extent that, like, people really think that is CP equals Buteyko. What can we do about this? I mean, I do my best, but, like,
I think it's a Western idea, everything, because we want to measure everything. And it's difficult enough to measure the breath, because even if you measure the respiratory rate, it's one part of the picture. And the control pause, it's timeable, it's measurable, it's accessible to everybody. We do use the control pause, we use the Bolt score, because it provides us feedback, but I don't want to make breathing a performance. When people start making breathing a performance, then it hampers the very thing that they're trying to do. But here's the thing, Robin. People who are susceptible to chronic hyperventilation syndrome are often perfectionisms. They have perfectionist tendencies, and they want to put in 100%. So 100% effort goes in, but sometimes too much effort, or to be honest with you, any effort is counterproductive with this one. We really want to relax into the breath and to allow it to happen. There are times, you know, I do have students, don't do the CP, don't worry about the CP, don't worry about any of that. It's all about breathing effortless, and that's really where it's at, and feeling better from it, you know. But yeah, it's out
I'm
there.
glad to hear that, because for many of my students, because of that, because they tend to be more on that, you know, they want to get it right and they want to do it the best. And I can see that, hear that just in my intake with them. And I'm like, we're not even, you know, like I'll say, I'm going to do a little breath assessment, and I do it and I don't even talk about it. I write down whatever their CP is, but I don't
Yes.
even talk about it. And I don't assign that for them to go
Yeah.
home and track. And then next, I give them the breathing practice. And then the next time they come in, I say, okay, I'd like to do the breath assessment like we did last week. And then I write down, you know, and I don't talk to them about
Yes.
it,
Yeah.
because I know they'll just go chasing after it, you know, like trying, it's going to
Yes.
become all about that. And they'll completely miss it. And I think people, I've heard people say they just get too frustrated with Buteyko because they can't get their CP to change, and
Yeah.
it's this. And I'm like, that's not what it's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
about. And they
Yeah.
don't when I say it's not a practice, it's a measurement. Do you practice taking your blood pressure? I mean, it's a measurement. Like if you put a thermometer in your mouth to take your temperature, like you don't walk around with the thermometer in your
Yes.
mouth.
Yeah.
It's just it gives you some information
Yes.
that then you can then decide, oh, this is where I'm at and this is what I'm needing now. But it's not a practice in and of itself.
No, it's not. You won't increase the control pause by measuring the control pause. So there's no training effect. It just gives you a little bit of feedback. You know, I suppose it has got some merit as well, you know, in terms of if you're feeling tired, your control pause is down. If you've got a head cold coming along, your control pause is down. If a person with asthma is feeling queasy or chest tightness, their control pause is down. Um, it's a good measurement for people with sleep apnea if they've got high loop gain. For people with panic disorder, to get an idea of their sensitivity to carbon dioxide buildup, because very often they have they've got a strong aversion to the feeling of suffocation. And I would imagine that's with your trauma group as well. So yeah, you know what, there's nothing perfect with this, and that's the way it is, and it's just kind of working with it and gently working with it, and that's where it's at.
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah.
Robin, we'll close it at this because we've been talking for over an hour and the conversation has always been very, very good. How can people find out more about you?
Essential Yoga Therapy is the name of my business. So you can go to essentialyogatherapy.com. And there's lots of information on my website about my training programs. I do have a training program specifically for yoga teachers and therapists who want to do this incorporation of these ideas from Buteyko in a yoga context and working with the different pranayamas and the philosophy of yoga, and based on the yoga texts. And all of that's in Restoring Prana, my book, and the Svadhyaya Breath Journal, the workbook that goes along with it. The training program is all online, and we have 10 fabulous mentors who work with the students individually, and then we get together and we do a monthly class with me, and working their way through the practices in the workbook, and then also practicum, where they go and they teach the different pieces and get feedback on that, and then a quiz for each chapter to make sure they really are understanding that piece before moving on. And we're in our second cohort. We have a waiting list for the third cohort that will open in the fall. If you're interested, contact me through the website and let me know, and I'll put you on the list. And feedback has been really good. The students are really growing, and a lot of them actually have come through you. They've gone through the Buteyko, but they're yoga people, and they're trying to make sense of it all, and they're finding this beautiful weave in the program, and a place where they can really center and settle and say, okay, this is yoga, right? This isn't it's not yoga, as I always say.
Great stuff. Pleasure, Rowan.